Welcome, thank you. Welcome to this discussion of the gender pay equity gap in the nonprofit sector. Should be a lively and interesting discussion. Audience, please put your name and organization in the chat. And we were going to reserve questions until the last 30 minutes of the presentation because we want to give our panelists enough time to respond to all of the questions. So the panel we have today will be Jen Andrews from Shelby Farms Park, Olliette Murry-Drobot from Drobot Consulting, Anna Mullins from New Memphis, and Jennifer Pepper from Choices Memphis Center for Reproductive Health. This year, Momentum completed its 2021 Mid-South nonprofit compensation report. It's going to be widely available after our summit in August, but we are taking a time to have about 3 sessions during the summer about pieces of the report. So in this session, we're going to talk about how gender impacts compensation, culture, and benefits. So some of the key findings were that women are slightly more likely to be leaders of grassroots organizations than men. Women are nearly twice as likely to serve as the CEOs of organizations with budgets between $250,000 and $1 million. And men are more than 2 times as likely to serve as CEOs of organizations with budgets above $2.5 million. Kind of interesting. The second part of that is, and I've got this screen, organizational culture. Female CEOs are twice as likely to strategically utilize employee retention strategies, and female CEOs are twice as likely to have a difficult time retaining development and fundraising staff. Lastly, CEO compensation. Compensation of female CEOs lags behind that of male CEOs in organizations with budgets of $250,000 or more, and male CEOs are slightly more likely to have given raises to staff leadership, program staff, and administrative staff in the last 5 years. All very interesting information. So our first question, female CEO, I'm sorry. All right, I think that's all of the information. So now let's jump right into it. First off, what are you seeing in the nonprofit sector from your own perspective regarding the differences in gender as it relates to organizational culture, benefits, and compensation? And we're going to start off with Jennifer Pepper.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Hey, y'all. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm excited to be here. I love to talk about this kind of thing. Um, something, so I also want to preface and be transparent about I lead an organization of 98% female and femme embodied folks. And I have, because my work has always been in sexual and reproductive health, HIV prevention and care. It's really been a heavily dominated female work experience for me, which I'm really grateful for in a lot of ways. I've had examples of strong leaders who were women, women of color, and that is not an example lots of people get throughout their career. And so I'm very proud to have that. And so some of the trends that I see within our organization is in general, I really see there's this fight for more salary transparency because when we are secret about salaries, the only people that benefit from that are typically white men. And so really trying to break down those silos and be more transparent um, and using more data to make decision making. Um, and I think those are 2 really important things that get us past these pay gaps, particularly salary transparency.
All right, great. Thanks. Thanks, Jennifer. Olliette, so what are you seeing
Well, I was not surprised about the findings at all. In my role now as a consultant, I work with I would say mostly women-led organizations. And most of those organizations are smaller organizations. Funding is always an issue. I think also the type of work that the organization does also has some impact on funding as well, which has impact on compensation and benefits for staff members. Most of those organizations have majority women in leadership roles as well as staff. I do believe, who serves on the board makes an impact. Oftentimes, it's also a lot of folks on the board sometimes are from the corporate sector, so they bring in, I guess, those factors from that environment. And so yeah, I think board makes a difference. I think who's leading the organization makes a difference. I think the type of work the organization does makes a difference as well in terms of, again, funding and being able to provide compensation and benefits for staff members.
All right, thanks. Anna?
Yeah, I think all the comments so far I would echo. Within at the nonprofit that I work for, we talk about economic development. That's sort of and workforce development. And one thing I'll just call out is where at the start of this conversation is, this study focuses on pay for the leaders of nonprofits, but I think it's important for us to recognize that pay disparities across sectors apply, and to all of our employees, and knowing that there are so many more women who work at a nonprofit in our city than men. I think that this is an important conversation, not just about the impact on the nonprofit community, but also the impact this has on our general ability to develop economically, to drive economic mobility, to help people build wealth in our community. So, I look at that in terms of sectors that just are really prominent in our community. So, some of our largest employers being like government and Shelby County schools. And we have so many nonprofits in our city, from small to, massive ALSAC, St. Jude organizations. And if the trend is that they are 75+% women and we are paying women less, I think that has huge consequences for our city. So it's not just a conversation, although, I do think we are focused and should be focused on the consequences for our own individual organizations and how it helps us deliver on our mission. I think there is a bigger elephant in the room that I think is important for us to remember, that we're part of, setting standards and leading with best practice at our own individual nonprofits has hopefully a cascading positive benefit for our whole community. I would just add to Jennifer's comment in particular around pay transparency. One thing that we've had to be really intentional about at New Memphis as we hire is not, because so many of the folks that we're hiring have experience in nonprofits, or, whether that be, again, higher ed or a traditional nonprofit or an arts organization, you're trying to vie for talent, if that's the kind of organization you run, that probably has some experience in this sector. So oftentimes starting pay, like even though you as a person hiring, maybe thinking like, okay, like here's the general band that we're hoping for. But if you find an amazing candidate and you're talking with him or her, and you ask that like very prickly question, like, well, what are you currently making? And if they say $10,000 less than you were hoping to pay somebody, I feel like the natural response for somebody hiring is like, yes, like we're going to get this person on the cheap. And we've had to be really thoughtful about saying like, that is not the case, because in order for us to course correct this, it might mean that I'm hiring somebody from a university who's just been underpaid, frankly, based on their education and work experience, or somebody from another nonprofit who's been underpaid. And it doesn't benefit me as the employer or them as the employee to bring them in under that scale. So I think that's sort of an actionable thing that we can all be doing as we think about building our teams.
Great, thanks. Good comments. Jen?
Well, I agree with everything the other speakers have said so far. I feel, as I was preparing for this event, I had to acknowledge that I feel very fortunate that I've worked at an organization that's had tremendous female leadership really from the beginning since we were founded. We've had male CEOs as well, but just a ton of women in key leadership roles, including the top spot, board members, board chair. I've had wonderful female mentors, which has been really helpful. And I think, what I'm seeing more of in the nonprofit landscape locally and probably nationally is more of a focus on culture. I think every company wants to talk about culture and say that they've got a great work culture, but I think more people are taking steps to define that and to be explicit about what it means, not to try to control what people believe, but to be really clear about what your values are. We have a handbook that we wrote together years ago. And so before we hire people, we send them that handbook and we say, read over this. And if it sounds like a place you could thrive, then great. And if it sounds like a place that is not for you, you need to really listen to your instincts about that, because we're not kidding, when we talk about our culture, culture of diversity, a culture of inclusion, a place where women and all people, all genders across the whole spectrum can show up and be who they are, their whole selves. I see more people doing that. I see also more funders asking better questions about how your staff is composed. Not all funders, but there are some who want to know, do you have a staff that's representative of the people that you serve? Do you have a board that's representative of the people that you serve? And I'll say, that's tremendously helpful. There's an awful lot that we women CEOs can do to change things, but we also have to acknowledge that our boards often make a lot of the decisions and hold a lot of the power that we have. And twisting the elbow, on a funding basis really helps make the case and reinforce how important it is in board recruiting.
Great, thanks. Jennifer, I want to go back to you for a second. You were doing some really hard yay and nay when Anna was speaking. And so I want to give you an opportunity to respond, to elaborate. I think it's when she was talking about pay transparency.
Well, yeah, well, and when she spoke about workforce development, right? I mean, and I think we all know like how hard the pandemic has impacted women in the workforce and how much our economy has lost because of that. I mean, and you start to think about, I'm really proud at Choices that we're a family-friendly work environment. If you need to bring your kid and sit in your office while you're doing your work, then that's okay. And we making space for families and for people providing care, which traditionally, and I know we're talking about men and women, and so to my trans folks, like that's the dichotomy we're speaking in right now, but know that I know you're there and acknowledge you and value you. But oftentimes women are caregivers, right? And so having to make space for that, and it absolutely impacts their ability to show up to work and to participate fully, right? Pay transparency, like I make $130,000 a year to be CEO at Choices. That's what I make. If you're not making that and you're running an organization of comparable size, talk to me, because you should. And I think just being really, like, it's radical that I said that to you, right? Like, we don't talk about what we make. And so it's a thing I can do. It's safe for me to do. And so it's important for me to do, because it's not safe for everybody else to do that, right? My staff know what I make. They all know what each other makes. It's another example of when you withhold information, you're holding on to power, right? And when you give information, you're sharing power. And I think that's really what salary transparency is about. And yes, and also Anna's, don't get people on the cheap. Like that makes you not a good person. Like, you've decided what that job is worth, pay that person what that job is worth, and don't let them lowball themselves, right? Like, that's also about developing people professionally and being like, helping them negotiate better for themselves in the future. But yeah, I really appreciated Anna saying that.
No, that's such I love that you just said it, because when we say pay transparency, like, that's what it means. And like, I think it does feel, it feels uncomfortable because of just the way that the corporate, like, the sort of corporate tradition of wielding power in that way, but also just how gauche it is to like talk about money in our society. Like, so I think all of those things come into play, and especially as women where we're like, don't want to be gauche. But I think that I've always said, what people are afraid of around pay transparency is that X employee will learn that Y employee makes more, and then they'll come into your office and demand more. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what it means. And if you don't have a very thoughtful reason why that other person is making more money, which can be they have more experience, they have more education, they're bringing more value, they have more responsibility, they're managing more people. There are a ton of reasons why Jen is hopefully being paid more than some of her coworkers who don't have her level of responsibility experience. So if you can't articulate those things to every person who would come into your office and say, I should be making this much, then they should be making that much. And if you can't afford them, then you shouldn't have that position. And I think it does feel, it is a push and pull, and money is finite. But that's, to me, again, like if you have a sense of this is the position, this is what I need out of this position, and therefore this is the pay, like it's a pretty simple equation. And so I don't think it has to be as uncomfortable as people think it is.
I think you mentioned pay bands, like having policies and like structures around those things helps too, right? That it's not just like, oh, I like this person, or I think this person is, or what, like it's like there's always a little discretion, but then it becomes more formulaic, right? Which humans, we're not fair and objective people as much as we want to be, right? So some space and guidelines around that, I think also are just immensely helpful.
Right, this has been great. All right, so next, many female leaders, we know, being leaders, you guys being leaders in organizations, have felt bias and inequality. You've experienced it, you felt it from not only your boards, but staff and the community in general. So how do you as a female executive combat that for yourself and for your female staff? So where's the pushback? How do you handle any kind of bias or inequality? Olliette?
I think talking about it openly, I realized at the last organization that I served as the executive director, when I looked around, we only had one Black woman on the board of directors. I don't think that was intentional. However, when we oftentimes recruit board members, we look at positions, we look at who has access to whom, who's within what networks, and oftentimes that will lead to inequities that we really, unintentional inequities. And so as an organization, we were serving mostly Black women. And so, that looks a certain way when folks will look at the board and say, well, you're serving mostly Black women. However, when you look at the board, so we had open conversations about that and how to change that, and really looked at how we ended up, looking that way. Also, I would just say, as a Black woman running an organization, we often, I would get lots and lots of resumes. We never had a problem finding folks. I know sometimes that's the word, you can't really find someone, you may not be able to find Black candidates. But I think because people saw me in that role as executive director, they're like, oh, I got a shot. And so we would get lots and lots of resumes from women and Black women and women of color. And because of that, most of the leadership team was majority women. It was pretty diverse. I mean, we had Black, white, trans, cis, you name it. It was pretty diverse in terms of what our staffing looked like. But yeah, because of the work that we were doing, and we were looking at domestic violence, which is, I think, is a reflection anyway of inequities in society, right? We had no choice but to tackle racial and gender equity and classism and some other things just because of the work that we did. So we would have open conversations. The leadership team would have open conversations about that. And oftentimes we would also have conversations with the board. And sometimes they were uncomfortable uncomfortable conversations, but they were required conversations to have just because of the type of work that we did.
Great, thanks. Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of things that I have done and that I encourage or try to create a culture for our staff, is just be willing to have the conversation. And I will admit it's a lot easier to do. I don't know. This list of, as you asked, like, if you experience bias from your board or your staff or your boss, and then like funder is like such like, we'd have to have a whole other panel to talk about how to deal with that with donors, because I haven't cracked that nut. But I think just creating space to have mature and respectful conversations and having the bravery to do it is something that I did not have early on in my career, but I think I developed as I had great female like mentors and friends who kind of helped encourage me in that way. And I would say like 9 out of 10 times I've had to have the conversation, it has been well received, a sort of aha moment for the person receiving it. It's led to like change in behavior or change in practice or an examination of something that's not like, oh yeah, we fixed it, but it and then there's that 1 out of 10 times that someone, gets very defensive or it becomes, sort of, not what you wanted. But to me, it's less about being sort of a warrior or kind of the way in which, women are sort of told to like go in and like, but just to say like, hey, like you may not know this, but this felt this way, or like this system is built in this way, or like, I mean, the organization that I run has had a female leader since its creation, and yet still when I inherited the organization, some of our employee policies were just inherently, I mean, some of sexist is probably, but there were like obvious things there were biases in there. And I know it's because they were sort of built over time with, board members or partners, but no one really challenged, like, why is this the case? And I think when I voiced that, everybody from our board to our existing team were like, yeah, why that you're absolutely right. And then they've challenged me, which has been amazing, where, I pushed to say like we have to have paid maternity leave, and then a year later an employee on our team said, why don't we have paid paternity leave? And I was like, interesting idea, let's do that. So I think once you open up the door to have those conversations, I think it will help. I certainly have my own biases as well, so I think it's helped me as a leader not say like I've got all the answers, but to first all just continue to like grow and develop together.
All right, thanks, Jen. I hear your how you've been able to combat that, if you've ever even seen it in your organization, but I'm sure you have.
Yes, absolutely, I have. It is thrilling and interesting to work at a park, which, by the way, you may hear some ambient noise. I'm at the park right now, so there's often park activities happening out on the porch. Everybody comes here, and our donors and our patrons, our elected officials, everyone across a very wide spectrum of viewpoints comes here, and we interact with everybody. So I have experienced all kinds of things in my time here, including a lot of great kindness. But I'll tell you a story that I think illustrates how I'm trying to handle this. This happened with a partner organization that's not a nonprofit. I had to talk with someone there about something unimportant to this conversation, but it was a little hot, and he called me pumpkin twice in the conversation. And I found it so jarring because, like I say, Shelby Farms Park Conservancy is a place that, just celebrates female leadership. And we've all of our C-suite are female. I'm just spoiled in that way, It was so diminishing and so dismissive, and I really hated it. It was really a yucky feeling to have happen. It was not the end of the world. We resolved the issue. I declined to continue talking to him because of the way he spoke with me. And I did talk with his supervisor, who was my peer at that organization. And We handled it there too. Nothing happened on their end. That's not their culture. But I decided, even though I felt really embarrassed about it, honestly, I felt humiliated. I decided it was important to talk about it. And now I talk about it with anybody and everybody, as you can see from this group. But all of my staff, I mean, I talk about it all the time. I use it as an example because I think it's important, especially for the men that I work with, for them to understand that this still happens. This is not an old thing that's no longer part of our culture. These things still happen. They're not going to stop me from getting my job done, but they're still not okay. It's not okay to do that. And I think it's important to be vulnerable, even when you feel embarrassed or humiliated about someone doing something like that to you, to share that experience with others, because I also believe there are a lot of men who will get this wrong, but who would like to get it right, but for whatever reasons have not taken the steps to educate themselves or have not been part of a culture that prioritizes this. And if somebody wants to get on the journey, I will take their hand and walk them as far down the road as they'd like to get. So I think that is really important. It's not easy for me. It feels very vulnerable to share things that are disrespectful or diminishing. You know, years ago, I had an elected official who every time I came before the body that I needed to report to would comment on what I was wearing, you know, and it was fine. I mean, he thought it wasn't fine. I don't know why I'm saying that. He meant it as a compliment, I guess. But, you know, I would sit there for hours before it was my turn to go up, and there were no comments about anything that men were wearing, you know, and I wasn't wearing anything wild or crazy. You know, and I've shared that a lot with the men that I work with, you know, that it just is a way to separate me from everybody else that's doing that work, that's going down there, and put me in a slightly different category. And I'm not asking for a special advantage, not asking for anything that other people aren't entitled to, just want to get my work done, ideally.
I think I would echo whatever.
Interesting. Yeah. So
And
Jennifer, yeah, let's hear from you. You've got a 98% female workforce. So yeah.
I feel when Jen talks about working with outside partners or other vendors. So we have, you know, this came into fine tune for me over the last couple of years when we were building our brand new facility. And so I was having to work with all male vendors in construction and architecture and experience some of the same things Jen talked about. You know, babe, sweetie, this, that, and the other. And I think like Anna started us with just, and Jen, like I also hear and feel you when you talk about it being vulnerable, and I don't want to do it, and it makes me uncomfortable. But it's the same with, you know, gender, race, age. When people say messed up things, we have to say that to them, right? And not in a call out, but a call in kind of way. Like, you know, unless they just are like dead set on being what they are. But most people, I agree, like don't want to be jerks. Like they just haven't thought about it. You know, and so most of the time I will give them that energy that it takes to say, don't call me sweetie, and here's why. Or that joke isn't funny, and let me tell you why it's not funny, right? It's also as leaders, us being willing to say and do those things and demonstrate that ability helps our staff feel that maybe someday they can do that or feel safe to do that too, right? Because we're always leading by example as well.
Right. Very interesting. So in addition to the gender pay equity gap we also seem to have differences in the way men operate in the workplace as opposed to women, especially when it comes to an organizational culture. So our study found that women are twice as likely to provide professional development for staff, where men are less likely to do things like social gatherings. Um, men are less, they're twice as likely to struggle with retaining staff. So what do you think accounts for that? Like, why is it on some things it seems that women are much better at and men struggle and vice versa? Is it how is that, or how do you see it? And do you have this within your organization? So Anna, start there.
Yeah, I wish I had a more thoughtful answer. I mean, I think that men and women are different. I think that we have different experiences and we often evolve in different kinds of cultures and have, so, you know, I won't get into the like how much of that is innate or, but I don't know, like I did my undergraduate thesis on like women's contributions to conflict resolution, like women at the peace table, and just this sort of looking at this reality that a very small percentage of women were invited to the peace table, particularly in like Middle Eastern countries and in conflicts that were raging when, unfortunately, I was in college, which feels like a long time ago, but that they were just innately better at conflict resolution, negotiation, sort of creating, both avoiding conflict and also solving it. So I spent like a year thinking about this, and as somebody who grew up in like the third wave of feminism, and you know, as we were still evolving, but just this thought that like men and women are the same. We could all do the same. We should be paid the same. We, you know, like we should be paid the same, but we do, I think, bring different strengths to the table. So I don't necessarily like balk at women do this differently. I think that I'm sure there are some things, if you were to look at a broader study of disparities between how men and women do certain things in a nonprofit or any company, where men do something better, like they're just better at, you know, giving direct feedback or whatever, might be negotiating their salaries, for example. They tend to be better at that. So I think that, you know, I try to lean into my strengths. And so whether that's, you know, and I think all women should lean into their strengths. So if we see that we're, you know, generally better at building, you know, I think have, and again, I'm speaking in like broad generalities, but women as a general group can be more successful in building community, which translates to building culture. They're more successful often in, again, sort of caretaking, and that can, again, contribute to culture and professional development, and just thinking about how you are stewarding individual employees as a sort of, again, social unit. So I think that makes sense. I hope that what, you know, in our organization, because part, you know, this is sort of part of how, you know, some of the services that we provide, I see it as a benefit that we can like deliver some best practice to some of our male leaders who may not either, you know, and I do think there might be a distinction between like how good we are at it and also how highly we prioritize it. Because I do think that, and I think somebody, I think maybe Jen mentioned this earlier, that I think all of us, nonprofit to the corporate sector, are becoming more well-versed in what culture is and trying to define it and understand it and cultivate it. So it's not just something that happens, but it is something that is intentional. So I'm pleased to see lots of men that I work with, not in necessarily at New Memphis, but at our partner companies and just all kinds of organizations who come to New Memphis for professional development and leadership training. They are curious about this topic. And I've had more men ask me about like emotional intelligence and culture building and diversity and inclusion, and that is encouraging. So you know, I think we might be turning a corner, but I remain optimistic.
Jen?
You know, I really wrestled with this piece of the data, and I agree with everything that Anna just said. And at the same time, I feel very conflicted about this. I think, you know, I am a very introverted thinker. I am the least likely CEO in the city to plan a social event. Least likely. I'm not good at fun stuff. I've always felt a little bit outside the traditional female experience. Although I know many of us are not, you know, I'm not a mother. I'm, you know, I have a life partner, but I'm not married. You know, and so I feel like I've confronted a lot of assumptions about what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a woman leader that have not really felt like I could fit into them easily. And at the same time, I really resent the idea that I would have to model my leadership after the way men succeed in order to be successful. I also think all of this is too binary. It's just not how we experience gender. It just isn't. But I can't deny that there are intuitively, to me, things about women that are true and things about men that are true. So I feel like I'm holding these two conflicting ideas in my mind. Like I said, I agree with everything that Anna said. All of that tracks for me. And at the same time, I think we have to be a little bit or I need to be a little bit careful in wrestling with this data to really understand what it means. I mean, I've got kind of an armchair theory around the investments in staff development. I'm an armchair meaning I don't really have a lot of data or any data to support this. But I wonder if because for women, and this is probably true for most marginalized people, we have to work so hard and often harder to get where we're getting to, that we really highly value the tools and resources that helped us develop our skills because we knew that our credibility would not be assumed. I really highly value my experience at New Memphis Institute. Those programs that I went through, I can draw a direct connection to my growth in my company. And I fully believe that I wouldn't be, this is not an advertisement for Anna's company, but fully believe I would not be in this role if I didn't have those tools because I didn't have them otherwise. I'm not from here. I'm not from a well-connected background. I really valued and absorbed anything that I could find that helped me develop and grow. And so I wonder if that's a common experience that women have. And because they value it so much, they think other people will too. That's the armchair theory that I have no evidence for.
Great, thank you. And I really do appreciate your bringing up the gender stereotypes that we all, I think, live under and hark back to many times that aren't necessarily true. The world changes. So, Olliette, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I just think that, I don't want to get too into stereotypes because I'm also an introvert and also very unlikely to host a social gathering as well. I think Jen brought this up earlier about healthy environments and what they look like. And I do see a tendency of women, being more collaborative, it appears, being more vulnerable, more communication, more transparency. And, I don't know the reason why for that. I, again, worked with mostly female staff and they were mostly social workers and case managers. And all of them were very relational. I was the one that kind of stuck out like a sore thumb because I'm just more of an analytical person. And so it felt weird, but again, I saw a lot of the women that I work with having those abilities where I don't think I displayed those skills all that much, but I did learn over time just because it was a healthier environment, having, better communication and having gatherings and ways for folks to socialize and build relationship with one another. Also want to mention, I think a couple of the other panelists mentioned this, also just about navigating a male-dominated world. And so again, I think some of the skills I developed over time was just that, because I was navigating, a white male space and being able to survive in those spaces and get to where I needed to. I adapted some of their ways at times.
It's very interesting. Before I move to you, Jennifer, I don't want to leave that. You adopted their ways. Did you do that because it was easier?
At times, it was easier. And over time, I feel like it was important to show up as myself. And there's that whole conversation around equity about belonging. And that could be challenging at times. So as I feel like as I came more into myself and how I wanted to show up, I do think that it was more challenging. And I will say as a woman and as a Black woman, I felt it was more challenging navigating spaces.
All right, Jennifer.
I would echo Jen. I really like your armchair theory. I think it makes good sense to me because we do have to work harder, and it feels like, I know my networks are incredibly important and have been responsible for getting me where I'm at. And so, um, really working and helping other young professionals develop that. I also, like I want to go sit at the house at some point. I don't want to do this forever. And so we've got to train people to do it, or we're going to have to stay here forever. Nobody wants to do that, right? So um, that's the thing. It's just a mindset about learning and stuff. And I struggle with the you know gender is a social construct, right? So it's weird. It's weird to think about, but we, like Anna said, we're all socialized in certain ways, and our gender often dictates the way we are socialized, right? And so women are often socialized to be caregivers and nurturers, and I think that you can't grow up in America without getting that as a woman or a female-bodied person, and so that comes out when we're in leadership roles.
So the next question, I want to move to the representation or the poor representation of women of color at senior levels in nonprofits. And how does that impact pay equity? It's something, of course, we all know it's an elephant just sitting to the side in this room. So how does that impact the pay equity discussion in nonprofits?
Well, I'll share it. I think it comes up sometimes at who's valued, who's seen as worthy. For a long time, I've served as the executive director for 2 organizations, and I felt like I had to walk around with my resume in my pocket because sometimes I would get questioned about my experience and my education. I think biases play into that in terms of how we view particularly Black women working in a social justice space and not wanting to be seen as the angry Black woman, right? What part of my job is speaking up, right? But having whole conversations in my head before I said something, because I didn't want to be seen as challenging or difficult to work with. Also, we'll say it comes down a lot to funding and donors. And I work with a lot of women-led organizations now, particularly Black women-led organizations. And that's a challenge in terms of securing funding for the type of work that they do. And sometimes they are doing work on pretty controversial issues. It might be around reproductive justice. It may be around HIV work. It may be around, LGBTQIA plus issues, right? And so again, the issue around funders, and a lot of times funders, sometimes they're white men, right? And so I think that comes out in terms of just being able to secure funding and being able to have a decent compensation package for yourself and staff members. I think that all plays a role.
Yeah, I think something that helps fight inequities in pay along gender lines, race lines, is, like I mentioned earlier, like that structure, right? So having like, this is the floor of what we pay for this position, and really trying to take as much subjectivity and bias out of the decision-making process around compensation. And yes, the board gets to set the compensation for the executive, but it doesn't mean there can't be a policy that they all agree to abide by, right, when they're setting compensation. And I think I tell people I want to be the last white lady to run choices, because it's always been white ladies, and I want to be the very last one. And so, I think about that when I'm helping the board recruit new board members, right? Because that's who gets to make that decision. And so that board's going to need to look a certain way for me to be confident they're going to make that decision, right? And so it's a long-term game for us too. My predecessor, she was here for 11 years. She never asked for a raise. She got a couple raises, but she never asked for one. And when I went to go negotiate my contract, and I'm the first ED at Choices with a contract, right? And so I asked for a pretty big bump compared to where she had been, right? And that's really important because we, as the CEOs, we set the ceiling, right? And so we have to set the ceiling where it needs to be set so that we can bring everybody else up with us, right? And often, I think just bringing up the ceiling helps everybody, especially in this position, right? Like, get the ceiling up.
I will say, to Olliette's, I mean, I think, we've talked a little bit about board diversity of boards. I mean, as we all continue to think about infusing our cultures and increasing priorities around diversity and equity and inclusion, I think we often just think about our teams, and it should extend to our board. Again, I feel like the donor part of this is like such a challenge. I can't help, that there are more white men with money to give away, but I do think, even working on diversifying like your funder base and knowing that, it's yeah, you only know who you know. I will also say to Jen's point, I think something that I've had to be really conscious of, we're not a big organization by any means, but succession planning, like being intentional about that, as Jen's like, and knowing that like you can have a diverse staff where, you're 20 people and, there are 10 people who are not white people, that feels good. But if they're all at the bottom of your organization and you're not you're not building pipelines for not just internal promotion, but again, to say like, yeah, we have people at leadership levels all across our organization. We're diverse across the board. And I think it's easy for a board when, a CEO is stepping away or stepping down to look to the number 2 or the number 3 first, because, and so if you're not diversifying those positions, you're going to have a white-led organization for all of time, which again, I mean, we have a really diverse board, and I think they, and I'm glad I got this job for sure. But like, I do that, that's something that I think, current CEOs have to be thinking about, and smart boards should be thinking about. So that's my contribution to that.
That's an excellent point, because right, the internal promotion, especially at the CEO level, is often the kind of the low hanging fruit, right? As the internal promotion, like I get that, that's okay. And so yeah, yes, your executive team being diversified is just as important as your board.
I'll share something that's related, but a little bit of a tangent, but I think does connect back. I was also an internal promotion, but I did not think I would get the job. I really didn't. They were doing a national search. It was sort of a high profile, right as we had invested $70 million in the park and we're opening all of these new impressive things. It was a great, I was practical enough to know it was a great opportunity for people all over the country who wanted to come and lead a world-class park. And that was a difficult process, to put my name in the hat, or hat in the ring. I feel like I'm confusing that, but you know what I mean. Because I really thought I was the underdog, and I thought it would sting, to have been at the park for so long and then not get it. But I'll tell you the reason I made the decision to go ahead and try was because of the way that my board constituted the search committee. And it was, I think, 3 men and 3 women. It was diverse. And I knew who was on the search committee because I was mostly running the board meetings and activities, so I knew how all that worked. And I thought to myself, I think that will be my fairest shot, is that these people will see me. And if they decide that someone else is more qualified, I think I would trust them to make the best decision. I'm not going to be discounted because of my gender. I felt confident in that because of the makeup of the committee. So my broader point would be, when it comes to representation, I think there are lots of different ways we can think about this. And if any of you are, applying for an executive job or to run a nonprofit, and I love my job, but if ever I were to leave, and look at something else, it's absolutely a question I would ask. What is the makeup of that search committee? Because it takes a lot of time and emotional labor you know, to get involved in a search like that. And it's a lot of responsibility that you have in your role once you get into it. And I think it's an indication of what you can expect from your board.
Well, in our reports, we found that in the Mid-South, men are twice as likely to serve as the executive director of an organization with a budget of $2.5 million. And so let's talk about boards. Boards are responsible for setting the compensation. So why do you suspect that boards tend to pay men at a higher rate than they do women? What goes on in the boardroom you think that influences that?
So many things. Also, so many things. I my experience has been that when I have managed male-bodied employees, that they have been more upfront about their salary requirements and more just, I don't know the right word, but like sure-footed, like, nope, this is what I'm worth, this is what I need. And I think that type of negotiation is also better well tolerated from men, right? To get to Olliette's point, like I think we expect male-bodied people to act in that way, and it doesn't throw us off or make us uncomfortable when they do. And I think sometimes when women show up that way, like, I know my worth and I know what I'm like, it's off-putting to people. And I think, like I said, my previous executive director didn't ask for a raise for 11 years. Like, I think there's also this, like, just keep your head down, do a good job, you'll get rewarded, right? It's like, well, nobody's looking out for you the way you look out for you. And, so something I try to practice when it's possible, it fits organizational policies and guidelines. Like, if somebody works up the nerve to come ask me for a raise, right? And they've got some good reasoning behind that, and clearly they've thought about it, like, I'm gonna give them something because I want to encourage that behavior moving forward, right? So I may not be able to give them what they're coming into my office to ask for, but maybe I can give them an extra professional development opportunity that the clinic pays for, or, I can give them an extra something because I want to encourage them. I want them to have had a positive experience of going to somebody in charge and asking for something that they need or that they deserve or that they're worthy of. And so I try to reward it a positive way whenever I can. Like, yes, with all the grayness and caveats that go around that kind of stuff. But I think starting, like, so I hope that the young folks that work under me, by the time they get here, right, really feel able to negotiate their worth and feel able, because they've been able to do that along the way. Also, there's this whole idea that nonprofits don't deserve to make as much as the corporate world in general, right? And I think some of that comes into play around that too. All of this stuff is intersectional, right? This gender stuff doesn't live on its own. The race stuff doesn't live on its own. The corporate versus nonprofit stuff doesn't live on. It all intersects to impact all of us. Which is why I like having these conversations, because they can go on for a very long time.
Yeah, I would say, sexism is one of them. And sexism can be internalized as well. I think what we think about traditionally as, strong leadership skills are typically how men have shown up in the workspace, particularly white men. So I think sometimes that's seen as having stronger leadership skills. I think also who's on the board, we keep getting back to that, right? Who's on the board. So if it's more men on the board, they might, they see themselves as leaders, right? And so they're more likely to think, okay, a man, a young man, right? It may not think about, a woman, a female, leader, and even when I see, sometimes female leaders, it might be in spaces that we call so-called working on women's issues, right? And so I think that also plays into, funding and donors and board members as well. I think it's a lot of factors.
So I'm one of those organizations at 5 million plus for budget. We're right above 5 million. We have a pretty complex business for like a traditional nonprofit, and that we raise a lot of money. But we also have sort of for-profit lines of business. We're operating a hospitality center. I've got retail business. I'm a landlord to 2 restaurants. What I'm saying is, and plus on top of all that, we're operating one of the largest urban parks in the country every day. What I'm saying is, if I would have a great case to take to my board, and I would have great results to show as well. But I want to be honest in that I have a hard time seeing myself doing that. I feel very awkward about negotiating on my own behalf. I feel great about negotiating on behalf of anybody else, but I feel very awkward about even now talking about it feels awkward, and I'll tell you why. To me, it's because I come from a working class background, and when I see my salary number at the top of the pay chart, there's never a time I don't feel a little guilty about it. I shouldn't, because it doesn't match what's on this data, but it's by far the most anybody in this organization is paid. And then I look down to the bottom of that pay chart, and even though I've increased wages over time, and we look at our pay ranges annually to make sure that they're fair and comparable to similar organizations, there's a huge gap between what the person who makes the least in my organization is paid and what I make. And I don't really know how to reconcile that. I really appreciate Jennifer's comment about raising the ceiling, and the idea that if you raise the ceiling for yourself, then you're raising it for everyone. You're really raising it for the organization. Because the way I'd been thinking about it was, if I ask for more, where does that come from? Is it in any way punitive of other people down the line? If more money was going to be put into salaries, shouldn't I put it somewhere else? Shouldn't it go toward the people who make the least in the organization? It's a very difficult sort of martyr syndrome, being conditioned to sacrifice, being willing to sacrifice. That's a lot of the reason that we end up in these nonprofit CEO spots in the first place. It's just very complex. I think this is very helpful for me, not that that's the reason that you guys did this, but just preparing for this panel was very helpful for me in thinking about, maybe my board needs to see this data. Maybe I need to share my experience being part of this panel and let them see this, because at the end of the day, that's who makes a lot of these decisions,
Something we're gonna do. So we just finished a compensation study. We were lucky enough to have somebody on our board that could get that done for us. So we just went through a compensation study, and we did really well, which I had suspected we might. We've been working really hard on pay. We, implemented a living wage back in, I think it's been 7 or 8 years now. So, and I'm stealing this from Ben and Jerry. So not only have they given us this beautiful ice cream, but when they owned the company, and we're still running it, right? It's owned by a national conglomerate now, but they had a bylaw in their organization, corporate bylaws, that said the highest paid employee could never make more than 8 times the lowest paid employee. And so I am going to ask my board to implement a similar bylaw next year that is going to lock my salary in with the lowest paid employee. And so if I want to raise, then I'm going to have to bring up the lowest paid employee, which is going to create that word we like, compression. And that means everybody else is going to have to come up too, right? And it's something that the board has to adopt their bylaws annually. One board can't commit the next board to their bylaws. So they'll, perhaps there'll be a conversation every year. It does limit the compensation the board can offer, right? But I don't see the problem with that. And it ties our success together in a really real way that staff can see. Because Jen, I feel everything you say about that. I also grew up working class, and I'm like, I'm making more money than anybody in my family ever made. I should be thankful. And it's like, no, I deserve this money and some more, and so do my people, right? So I will let you know how that all goes. But I've got board members that are supportive of it. They wanted this comp study first to make sure they weren't underpaying me. Turns out they're paying me just right because I did my data and my research when I asked for my salary. And so I'm gonna try to push them into this next step.
Yeah. In addition to the guilt, like I said, like I'm making it. But I think there's also as I increase people's pay or my pay, I have to go raise that money, right? So like, it's not, we're talking about money, like there's this like endless pool of it, and there isn't. So like, I don't want everybody listening, or, even just as we look at these numbers, for us to get like, oh, we all should, get a 30% pay increase. And then, I think we should, if we can make it happen. But yeah, I think that's where, to the question at hand about like the board composition and how, we've talked a lot about having like a diverse board with diverse experiences. I also think it's important for the board, who certainly at our organization, and I imagine this is a trend across most, the composition of the board is mostly people who work or worked in the corporate sector. So they have what I think is, as somebody alluded to earlier, the misconception that nonprofit is different, when I'm like, nope, there's still jobs. Like, we're still all vying for the same talent. We're still all trying to have excellent teams. So I think that is something that I try to correct that language when I hear it. And I'll hear some people say, like, even just like when they're recruiting or thinking about, I won't like name any names, but just like thinking about like some nonprofits where, that like a funder was like, I met this, I'm going to pluck this person from the corporate sector to run this nonprofit. But if we're going to do that, we're going to have to really up the comp, because we got to pull them from the corporate sector. And I'm like, that just doesn't make sense to me. I'm not saying, if that person's the best person for the job, like, great, pay them what they get. But I wouldn't have this like separate sort of mentality for what is appropriate for a nonprofit and what is appropriate for a corporate sector job. And as we look at comps and we try to, as we're all trying to figure out how do we negotiate, I suggest that we do not look across local nonprofits, rather than say like, well, people at other nonprofits like this, they pay this. And like, just look at the workforce in general. And then, and I think suggesting that boards do that too is important. I've experienced lots of people in the nonprofit sector that's used this language, and I am sympathetic, because again, I know that resources are finite, but they're finite for companies too. So I think we'll talk more about this, I think, in your last question that I have that you sent to us, but around like, how do we improve? But I think that's a big part of it.
Right. So since we're coming to a close, but I still want to turn our attention one last question about solutions. There's a paper out that's called Negotiation and Executive Gender Pay Gaps in Nonprofit Organizations. And that paper found that when there's female leadership on the board, the pay equity gap is reduced. And they also find that women are more apt to negotiate with leadership that's female instead of male. So what do you think that nonprofit boards, that organizations can do to address the pay equity gap using these findings?
Put more women in leadership roles on the board.
Oh, yes.
Be the easy answer.
More women.
How do we get there? Because I don't know if each of you could tell me what percentage of your board is female.
The vast majority of my board is female.
So I think mine is like, it's a little over 50%, but it's pretty evenly balanced.
I don't have a board at this moment, but I will say shout out to Momentum. I served as the board chair for Momentum, and I think the last 3 board chairs have been women, particularly women of color. So shout out to Momentum.
Okay, I don't know the percentage offhand. Mine is complicated. I've got 40 board members. 6 of those are appointments that I don't control. It is less than 50% women. I'm pretty confident, but almost all of the new board members that we've added in the past 3 years have been women. I don't choose board members, but I play a big role in identifying prospects and making recommendations. And when I took over, I set a goal for myself to only recommend women and people of color for the board, still fitting within all of our the measurements we like to use. You know, we want our board to be primarily C-suite. We want certain skills to make sure that we don't have skill gaps on the board. I think people thought that would be hard. It's not hard. You know, you just have to be intentional about it. And it's been great. It's been great because the truth is that you can't have great female or diverse leadership of a board unless you've got a female and diverse board. Like you've got to have people to pull from who can move into those seats. So in some ways, to me, it's been kind of a long game. You know, like I've got to recruit the right board members so that they can grow into those leadership roles, which is working well. We're not finished. We're not where we want to be, but we're getting close and doing well, and it's a great board. So I feel good about that. I just think people who, if there's an experience that you want to understand and better represent, the people who have that experience or who are closest to the source of whatever problem you're trying to solve are the ones that have the best solutions. And so often we tie ourselves in knots, you know, at the board level or wherever else, trying to guess what people's experiences are. And I think that's why representation is so important.
Also, I will say that I feel like nonprofits have to be intentional about board development, as Jen was saying. I think that's key, and also that the board, you know, with momentum, equity is really at the core of the mission, and equity has to be key for board too to be thinking about as well as in terms of how it leads the organization, and equity has to be at the core of the work that the board is doing as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like to me, it is about New Memphis and Momentum have actually been having these conversations around board development, not for our boards, but as a problem in our community, as a challenge for all of the many nonprofits and how many people in our community are vying for the same board talent. And we have to expand the pool. And what that means is, you know, you can go in and say, yeah, we want to diversify our board. We need, again, you know, we need more people of color. We need more women. We need more, you know, diversity in age or experience, or, you know, I think all of that is something that, thankfully, I think some of the bigger funders in our community are trying to help instill that requirement. But so often I'm just kind of a quick anecdote, like people come to New Memphis, nonprofit leaders will come to New Memphis and say, can you help me find some board talent? Because we have access to leaders that we've trained and that are kind of part of our network. And, you know, I would say the vast majority of the time, I know what they're asking for. They're asking for, they're looking for Black board leaders. And I'll go, great. We have such a diverse network of leaders, but then there's like 100 caveats. And like the top one is they have to be, you know, like connected to a big check. Essentially, they're either going to write a big check, but you know, they're influential enough at a company that they can have their company write a big check. And I completely sympathize with this because I understand how board slots where, you know, where you're like, okay, well, you know, are these dollars in jeopardy if that board member retires or rolls over? So we did not build the system and we have to work within it. And I, like, again, tons of empathy for that. I have to deal with that myself. But I do think creating board seats and just space on your board for diverse voices and knowing that those diverse voices may not be coming alongside. And I feel that way about the talent and the skills that they're bringing as well. So, you know, if all of your board are executives at companies, but you don't have anybody who you know, if you need real estate experience or marketing expertise or human resources expertise, these things that we who are running like smaller nonprofit teams may not have those talents on our teams, be able to utilize the board in that way. So I feel like, you know, in the conversation about diversifying one's board, it also sort of requires a CEO or an ED to open their mind a little bit to say like, you know, you might find a great young leader who's, you know, in their 20s or 30s, but who's deeply passionate and really talented, and is also, you know, bringing some additional diversity and perspective. You may be, you know, we've somehow, like when I inherited this job, there was sort of like a unspoken rule, like we don't recruit other nonprofit leaders onto our board. Why would we? And I was like, because they have all of this amazing experience that we can benefit from, and there's more women and more, you know, there's diversity in this space. So anyway, I just think that's something that we have to think about, that the traditional way in which we think about developing and building boards may have to change as well.
Okay, is that everybody?
I mean, I want to make one last statement on that. And I will say, I've been part of conversations that, given the demographics of Memphis and Shelby County, I don't think there's any excuse for there not to be any diversity on your board and on your leadership team. And anytime I go to the website of the organization and I'm looking, I'm like, you know, because you got to think about, who are you serving? You know, who are your clients? And again, given the demographics of the city and the county, if you can't find qualified, you know, Black folks or whatever the case may be, then I think you need to rethink your, you know, your board development. Yeah.
Great point. Any last comments before did everybody get a chance? Jennifer, did you weigh in? So before we open it up for comments, so we won't go over time, we've got about 38 minutes. I first want to thank each and every one of you. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has. And so thank you so much for agreeing to do this for us. And so I want to open it up now for questions from the audience. So just unmute yourself and present a question.
I'll ask a question. Can y'all talk about what role men play in all of these discussions? We don't have many men in the room, so which is unfortunate. So for those of them who are watching on Facebook or will see this recording, perhaps this will be helpful for them.
I think it's helpful to listen and to believe when your female colleagues tell you about their experiences and how their experiences are different than your experiences. I think that would go a long way. I think to look at data, right? Perhaps more people are analytical, but I think the listening and the believing, and that can be applied to all sorts of groups that are different than you. When they tell you what their experience is, take that as their experience, believe them, trust them, and help them move forward.
I think men are key. Men need to own this. I think it's, you know, like tackling anything else is like tackling racial equity and not having, you know, white folks to own that and be a part of the solution. So yeah, I think men are key.
Yes, they are. Any other questions? Because if we don't, we can end. I don't know. I don't know whether it's my eyes or my mind. That's why I said 38 when we had 18 minutes. So now we have 16. But if we don't have any more questions, I want to again thank you very much, ladies, Olliette, Jennifer, Anna, and Jen. This has been an eye-opener, and you may get conversations or phone calls from people in the audience, maybe even from me, to extend this conversation, because I think it's been a real eye-opener. So thank you so much. Any last words before we wrap it up?
Just delighted to have the conversation. Thank you guys for doing this study. And I mean, I will say Momentum, I think, has been a real leader in this space, and leading to create more transparency in salaries is, I think, not single-handedly something that y'all have done, but you've made a big difference. So kudos.
Thank you.
Yeah, ditto. Thank you for your efforts to do the compensation study. Just all that information is helpful, and I would appreciate it. And I welcome anybody's phone calls or emails. I love talking about this kind of stuff. Please feel free to reach out.
Well, great. And to the audience, after our virtual summit in August, we will release the report to everyone, and then you can read all of the great information that's in it. And like I said, it's an eye opener to me. So thank you so much. Have a great weekend and continue to be safe. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.